So, were you successful? Let's solve it together. Let's start with the first task, creating these components. I'll use the CLI for this. So with ngGC, I'll create my game control component with spec false to not get this testing file. And then I will repeat this for my odd component and then my even component here. So just like that. With that, we should have three new folders here. And now let's start in the game control. I'll keep this relatively simple. Here I will add two buttons where I say start game and also give this some bootstrap classes, button. Let's make it button success to have a green button. And then here I will say pause game on the second button. Maybe let's make this of type button alert to make it a red button. Button danger would be the right class. So with that, we have two buttons in game control. In app component, these were of course added to app module automatically since we used the CLI, these components. So in app component, I can now add them. So I will simply do this here in a new div with the row class here and then call XS12 as the width. Here I will add app game control. Let's have a look at our running application. ngServe is already running. That looks all right. That is the behavior I want. I'll open up the console so that we could see any potential errors, but that of course looks all right. Now when starting the game, we should emit an event. So in the game control component, first of all, I need to add a click listener to start game. And I will execute on start game, any method name you like here of course, and I will add it to my component TypeScript code. So here in onStartGame, I now want to set this interval. And I will store it in a property so that I can later access it and clear it. So I'll simply name it interval here. And here in onStartGame, I will set this interval equal to setInterval. As I said, a method supported by native JavaScript. And here I want to emit an event every 1000 milliseconds, which would be 1 second. And then the function here is a ES6 arrow function again. You could use a normal function, but then you would have to bind this to get the correct reference to this. So here I will use a ES6 arrow function. This is the function which gets executed on each tick. The function doesn't have any arguments, but here I want to emit an event. Now this event needs to be created, so at the top of this file I'll add another property, and this I'll simply name interval fired. Any name you like. This will be a new event emitter, and keep in mind event emitter needs to be imported from @AngularCore like that. Now this event emitter will in the end only hold a number as a value, so that is why I'll set the generic type here, or this value of this generic type, to number. Don't forget the parentheses to instantiate this event emitter so that you really get an instance of this object. And with that I can now call this interval fired and here emit, and I want to emit a incrementing number, so maybe there are a couple of ways of implementing this. I will simply store last number here and set this to 0 initially, and then I want to emit last number, this last number plus 1. Therefore the first emitted number will be 1, and thereafter I will increment last number so that I simply keep track of what my last emitted number was. So with that we should emit incrementing numbers. The next task is of course to make this listenable from outside. I can do this by adding @output in front of it with parentheses, and output needs to be imported from @AngularCore. Now this event can be caught from outside this component here. So that is my own event now firing, and I should be able to listen to it. Interval fired will be the event name since I didn't assign an alias here. So in the app component here on app game control, we can listen to this interval fired event and maybe execute on interval fired here. Of course, you can choose a different name. Now here in on interval fired, I will implement this method in app component. For now, I simply want to log the last number. So I will pass it on with $event. Remember, $event gives us access to the event data, which is the number in this case. So in app component, I know that I will receive my fired number or something like that, which is of type number. So I can simply output this here. So with that, if I save this, we should have a working application. We should be able to click this button, and then on the right in the console, we should see incrementing numbers every second. And that looks pretty good to me. Pause game, of course, won't work for now. So let's make it work by, well, implementing this pause game button. So here I'll add a click listener to the pause game button. And I want to call on pause game here, of course. So let's implement this method in the game control component too. And here I can simply call clear interval. And now I need to pass this interval, which was the reference of my interval I want to clear. So if we do this and reload the application, let's start the new timer. And if I click pause, we don't see any other values because interval is not firing anymore. No new events are emitted. Of course, if we restart, we continue at 3 because our last number wasn't overwritten. You could do this, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to reset the game state. I simply want to pause and resume here. So this is working. Now we need to implement the other components, odd and even. We already got them here, odd and even. And in there, in odd here, I want to output a paragraph, let's say, where I say odd dash and then the number, which I output via string interpolation. Now, of course, number is a property which doesn't exist right now. So I'll add a property, number, which will be of type number, but it's not initialized. Now, again, this should be passed from outside. So, as you learned it, we have to add input here with parentheses and importing this from @AngularCore. With that, we're now able to pass the data from outside into this component. So with that, number can be set from outside. So in the app component HTML file, we probably want to add something below our game control here, maybe a new row, but without the app game control component, instead with the app odd component here. And we will use ngFor to replicate this, though we don't have an array right now. We have to create this array. In the app component TypeScript file, right now we're logging any fired number. Well, we should do something else. We should have an array, odd numbers would be a fitting name, and odd numbers is simply an empty array at the beginning. We can even be clear about which type it will hold. The type will simply be an array of numbers. That would be the type definition. Now I'm going to duplicate this because we're also going to have even numbers. Now in onInterval fired, I want to check if the fired number, if it is odd or even. Now we can check this with the modulus operator. If fired number, and the percentage sign is the modulus operator, divided by 2. If what remains here, equals 0, well then we know it's even. So then we should use our even numbers and push the new fired number on it. Otherwise, we know there is something left over from this division, so it is an odd number, so we should push it to odd numbers. So now we're managing these arrays, and with odd numbers getting items which are odd, numbers which are odd, in the app component, here in ngFor, I can now loop through them, so odd number of odd numbers, so looping through this array. I can now pass this to my odd component, because remember, there we exposed the number input here. So I can bind to number. You could of course also choose a different name or assign an alias as you learned it. And I want to pass my odd number there. So the number I'm currently at in this iteration. Let's try this. We don't have even numbers yet, but let's see if odd numbers work. If we start the game, we indeed see odd 1, 3, 5, and so on. So this is working. This is working as expected. If we pause, we shouldn't see any other numbers. Now let's do the same for even. So for even, I will basically just copy the template code from the odd component, replace even, odd with even of course. And well, here in the even component itself in the TypeScript file, I will also receive a number, which will be of type number, and where I have to add input with parentheses to make it bindable from outside. So now just like with on the odd component, I can do the same with the even component and bind number from my parent component, which in this case is the app component HTML file, or the app component in general. So I'm going to duplicate app odd and replace it with app even. Of course, here I want to loop through my even number, so even numbers. So I'll store it in a temporary variable named even number of even numbers. Let's pass the even number here. And with that, we should now log both with odd and even in front of it. Let's see this if it reloads and I click start game, odd, even, and even. And the behavior you see here, that this kind of is below each other, well, that simply happens because that is how we placed odd and even. Odd numbers will always be sorted to the top here. You would have to manage all in one component to have them alternate. But that is exactly the behavior I want here in this case. So this structuring where we first have all the odd and then the even numbers. With that, the remaining pieces to change the styling. Now both templates look pretty much the same. We have a paragraph in both of them. So for odd, why don't we style this paragraph to be blue, have a blue color, blue text color. And for even, maybe we could choose green. And since we use style encapsulation here, even though we use the paragraph selector in both cases, each component will only receive the style set up in the respective style sheet. So if we do this and start the game one more time, we see odd is blue and even is green. So style encapsulation is also working fine here, and you really see the difference. So that was our assignment. I hope you enjoyed it. And with that, let's move on and dive deeper into components. So now that you learned more about components and data binding, and especially how you can communicate between your components, and how lifecycle hooks work and so on, you gained a lot of new knowledge, which is super important for most projects you're going to build, including our course project. So in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to fine-tune this. We're going to make sure that we can navigate between recipes and shopping lists, though our solution we'll add right now will not be the final one. We will improve this even more later in the course. And we will make sure that we can select recipes here and load them in the detail section. And generally that we have a working communication between our components. So let's dive into this.